Sometimes the strongest among us fall the hardest. And when they do, we learn who we truly are by how we treat them. In the frozen lands of the ancient Silvercrest Pack, no sight was more heartbreaking than watching a mighty alpha warrior reduced to helplessness, abandoned by those he once protected. Kade Ironheart had been the mightiest fighter in all of Shadowmere. His claws tore through enemies, and his howl echoed across the moonlit valleys. But when he returned from battle with a shattered spine and useless legs, everything changed. The Alpha King declared him worthless. The pack healers refused to help. Even his closest brothers walked away. In their harsh world, a wolf who could not shift or fight was left to die in the cold. But one person refused to abandon him. Elena was just an Omega servant, powerless and forgotten. Yet she had secret knowledge of healing herbs and broken bones. While the entire pack turned their backs, she alone dared to help the fallen warrior. What would make an Omega risk everything to save an Alpha the whole world had given up on? The wind howled across the valley like the voices of the dishonored dead, carrying with it the scent of pine and the promise of another brutal winter. Shadowmere had weathered countless seasons in these northern reaches, its stone halls and timber fortifications carved from the very bones of the earth by wolves who knew that survival meant strength and strength meant everything. For 30 years, Kade Ironheart had embodied that strength. His name was spoken in whispers around enemy territories, a legend that grew with each passing season. 7 feet of muscle and raw power, with arms thick as tree trunks and hands that could crush a rival's skull like an egg. His battle prowess, honed through years of combat training, had never known defeat. Warriors from distant packs had come seeking glory by facing him in combat, only to find themselves broken and forgotten beneath the northern stars. The Great Hall of Shadowmere bore testament to his victories. Trophies of fallen enemies hung from the rafters, their tokens telling stories of battles fought across frozen territories and mountain passes. At the head table where Alpha King Magnus held court, Kade's chair sat larger than all others, carved from ancient oak and decorated with silver taken from defeated rival alphas. For 3 decades, no wolf had dared challenge his right to sit there. But chairs meant nothing to a wolf who could no longer walk. The Omega quarters lay in the shadow of the Great Hall, a collection of low buildings where the lowest-ranking pack members made their homes in whatever comfort they could find. Here, the hierarchy of Shadowmere meant little. A former beta from a conquered pack slept beside a captured lone wolf, their past lives reduced to the simple reality of servitude. They were fed, clothed, and housed, for the pack understood that healthy Omegas were profitable Omegas, but they remained at the bottom of the social order nonetheless. Elena had lived in these quarters for 8 years since the raid that claimed her small pack and her freedom. She had been barely 16 then, taken from the coastal territories where her grandmother had taught her the old ways. Not the ways of claw and fang, but the gentler arts that most warriors scorned. The knowledge of which plants could heal a fever, how to set a broken bone, the careful balance of herbs that could ease pain or bring peaceful sleep. In Shadowmere, such knowledge was viewed with suspicion. The pack's official healers were old wolves who relied on harsh remedies, cutting and burning to drive out sickness. They spoke of honor and strength even when treating wounds, as if admitting to gentleness might somehow weaken their spirits. Elena had learned to keep her knowledge hidden, helping fellow Omegas in secret when sickness struck the quarters, never speaking of the small miracles she performed with careful hands and patient heart. She was unremarkable to look upon, which had proven both blessing and curse. Her brown hair fell straight to her shoulders, often braided simply to keep it from her work. Her face was pleasant but not striking, with gray eyes that seemed to notice everything while drawing little attention. She stood average height for a female wolf, neither tall enough to intimidate nor small enough to appear helpless. In a culture that prized dramatic beauty or obvious strength, Elena had found safety in being overlooked. Her hands, however, told a different story. Long fingers moved with the careful precision of someone who had spent years working with delicate things. Small scars marked her palms from gathering thorny herbs, and her fingertips were stained with the subtle colors of roots and berries she had ground for healing purposes. These hands had delivered babies in the Omega quarters, eased the passing of the elderly, and mended wounds that the official healers had declared beyond hope. Alpha King Magnus ruled Shadowmere with the wisdom of experience and the hardness of necessity. At 65, he had seen enough seasons to know that survival in these harsh lands required difficult choices. His gray beard was kept trimmed and neat, and his weathered face spoke of a wolf who had made peace with the weight of leadership. He was not cruel by nature, but he understood that showing weakness, even mercy, could invite challenges to his authority that might destroy them all. The Alpha's council consisted of the pack's most trusted warriors and advisors. Derek the Crimson served as his chief lieutenant, a wolf whose tactical mind had won them victories when brute force alone would have failed. Gabriel the Wise handled the pack's negotiations with other territories, ensuring they had the supplies needed for long winters. Owen Steelheart commanded their defenses, his scarred face testament to countless battles survived. These wolves had followed Magnus for decades, their loyalty earned through shared hardship and mutual respect. But even loyalty had its limits when it came to harsh practicalities. In the world of Shadowmere, an alpha's worth was measured by his ability to fight, to protect the pack, to stand against enemies when rival packs appeared on their borders. A wolf who could not shift, who could not stand in battle formation, who required care rather than providing protection. Such a wolf became a burden that the pack could not afford to carry. The diagnosis had been swift and merciless. When Kade had been carried back from the mountain pass, his legs lifeless and unmoving, his wolf spirit trapped inside, unable to heal him, the pack's healers had examined him with grim efficiency. His spine had been shattered by falling rocks, they declared. The damage was complete and permanent. No amount of healing magic or harsh remedies could restore what had been broken so thoroughly. The moon goddess has taken his warrior spirit, old Benjamin the healer had pronounced, his voice carrying the authority of 40 years treating battlefield wounds. What remains is merely flesh, no different from a lame animal that cannot pull its weight. The comparison had stung more than any physical wound. In their society, an animal that could not run was quickly put out of its misery. The fact that no one had suggested the same for Kade was perhaps the only mercy he could expect. Elena had watched from the shadows as the great warrior was carried to a small cabin on the edge of the territory, far from the great hall where his chair would sit empty. She had seen the careful way the wolves avoided looking directly at him, as if his condition might somehow spread to them. She had witnessed the uncomfortable silence that fell over the great hall during the evening meal, where his absence hung like a storm cloud over the gathering. But more than anything, she had seen his eyes. In those dark depths, where once had burned the fierce joy of battle, now dwelt something she recognized all too well. It was the look of someone who had lost not just their body, but their very sense of who they were. She had seen it in fellow Omegas when they first arrived, that hollow stare of someone whose entire world had been stripped away. The difference was that Omegas could sometimes find new purpose, new identity in their changed circumstances. An alpha who could not fight had lost the very core of his being. The first night after his return, Elena had crept through the darkness to the small cabin where Kade lay alone. She had told herself she was merely curious, that she wanted to see for herself how completely the mighty had fallen. But as she peered through the small window, she saw something that changed everything. Kade Ironheart, the terror of battlefields, the alpha who had never known defeat, was weeping silently in the darkness. Not the angry tears of frustration, but the quiet, hopeless sobs of someone who had given up entirely. His massive frame, which had once filled doorways and commanded respect through sheer presence, now seemed somehow diminished, as if his spirit had been the source of his physical grandeur. In that moment, Elena made a decision that would define both their fates. She could not undo what had been done to him, could not restore his legs or give him back his alpha pride, but she could offer something that no one else in Shadowmere was willing to give: the simple dignity of not being abandoned. She had waited until the deepest part of the night, when even the patrol wolves dozed at their posts, before making her move. From her carefully hidden collection of healing supplies, herbs gathered during brief moments of freedom, roots traded for favors with other Omegas, preparations made in the dark hours when sleep eluded her, she selected what she would need. Not to heal his broken spine, for that was beyond any mortal power, but to ease the pain that kept him wakeful and the infections that threatened to claim what life remained to him. The risk was enormous. An Omega caught stealing, for that was how they would view her taking supplies to help Kade, faced severe punishment. At best, she might lose meals for weeks. At worst, she could find herself cast out into the winter wilderness, left to die as surely as if she had been executed outright. But as she prepared her small bundle of medicines, Elena found herself thinking not of the risk, but of her grandmother's words, spoken in the firelight of their small cottage so many years ago. The measure of a person is not in what they can take, child, but in what they choose to give when they have nothing left to lose. Hidden beneath her simple woolen cloak, Elena carried more than herbs and healing salves. She carried the belief that even in the harshest world, even when surrounded by those who valued only strength and conquest, there remained room for gentleness, for mercy, for the quiet courage of choosing compassion over safety. The wind continued to howl across the valley as she made her way through the darkness, her footsteps silent on the frost-covered ground. Behind her lay the safety of anonymity, the comfortable obscurity of being just another forgotten Omega. Ahead lay uncertainty, danger, and the possibility of discovering whether the strength to heal might prove as powerful as the strength to destroy. The first touch of winter dawn painted the sky the color of old blood when Elena approached Kade's cabin. Her breath formed small clouds in the bitter air, and frost crunched beneath her feet. Despite her careful steps, the territory remained wrapped in sleep, save for the occasional snore drifting from the great hall or the distant sound of night creatures in the forest. She paused at the wooden door, her hand trembling not from cold, but from the magnitude of what she was about to do. Inside lay a wolf who could crush her with one hand, even in his weakened state, a wolf whose rage at his condition might turn toward anyone foolish enough to witness his helplessness. A wolf whose pride had been built on never needing help from anyone, least of all an Omega. But through the thin walls, she could hear something that made her decision final. The ragged breathing of someone fighting pain in silence, too proud to cry out, but unable to find rest. It was a sound she knew well from the Omega quarters, where showing weakness could mean losing what little safety one possessed. The door opened with barely a whisper. Kade's battle claws lay mounted on the wall just inside, their silver surfaces still stained with the blood of his last battle. The weapons seemed to watch her enter, a silent guardian of their fallen master's former glory. Kade himself lay on a simple wooden bed frame, his body covered by rough wool blankets that could not disguise the powerful build that had made him legendary. His dark hair, usually kept short in warrior fashion, had grown longer around his shoulders. His face, weathered by countless campaigns, was tight with the kind of pain that comes not just from wounds, but from the soul-deep agony of losing everything that defined you. His eyes opened at her approach, sharp blue eyes that had struck fear into enemies across the known territories. For a moment they held confusion, as if he could not understand why anyone would dare enter this place of shame. Then recognition dawned, followed quickly by something darker. "Get out!" His voice was a low growl, roughened by nights of sleepless torment. Even weakened, it carried an authority that had commanded armies. "Whatever you seek here, Omega, you will not find it." Elena stopped where she stood, but did not retreat. She had expected this reaction, had even prepared for it. In her experience, the proud were often the most difficult to help, their pain made worse by the humiliation of needing assistance. "I seek nothing, Alpha Kade," she said quietly, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I come only to bring what might ease your suffering." "My suffering?" His laugh was bitter as winter wind. "Look around you, girl. Do you see suffering or do you see justice? The moon goddess has spoken. The mighty Kade Ironheart, who thought himself invincible, has been brought low by falling rocks. Perhaps this is what I deserve for my pride." She saw him then, not as the legendary warrior of pack songs, but as a wolf drowning in despair so complete that he had begun to welcome it as punishment. It was a dangerous state of mind, one that could lead a person to refuse all help, to embrace their destruction as somehow fitting. "May I approach?" she asked, gesturing to the small bundle she carried. "I have brought medicines that might help with the pain." "Pain?" Kade's voice rose slightly, and she saw anger flicker in his eyes, the first real emotion she had witnessed from him since his return. "Do you think this is about pain, Omega? Do you imagine that some herb will restore my legs, my strength, my honor?" "No, Alpha," Elena replied honestly. "I cannot restore what has been lost. But I can perhaps make the days more bearable while you decide what manner of wolf you wish to be with what remains." The words hung in the cold air between them. She had spoken more boldly than any Omega should dare, and they both knew it. In the old times, before his fall, such presumption might have cost her dearly. But these were not the old times, and he was no longer the wolf who had inspired terror in his enemies. "What manner of wolf?" he repeated slowly, as if tasting foreign words. "Tell me, Omega, What manner of wolf can I be when I cannot even stand without help? His crude honesty was meant to shock her, to drive her away with the harsh reality of his condition. But Elena had tended the sick and dying for years. She had cleaned wounds that would turn strong stomachs, had held the hands of warriors as they drew their final breaths, had witnessed every indignity that flesh was heir to. The same manner of wolf you choose to be, she said simply. Your legs may be broken, Alpha Kade, but your mind remains sharp. Your hands can still hold tools, write words, craft things of beauty or purpose. Your voice can still tell stories, teach young warriors, offer counsel to those who need wisdom more than strength. Wisdom, he spat. What wisdom does a broken wolf possess? That pride comes before a fall, that the moon goddess enjoys humbling mortals who grow too proud? Such wisdom can be learned from any elder's tale. Elena set down her bundle and began unpacking her supplies. Small clay pots containing salves made from willow bark and meadowsweet, strips of clean linen, a small knife for cutting away infected tissue. Her movements were efficient and practiced, those of someone who had done this work many times before. The wisdom of suffering honestly faced, she said as she worked. Of learning to find value in what remains rather than mourning what is lost. Of understanding that strength comes in many forms, and that sometimes the greatest courage is simply choosing to live when death seems easier. Easy words from someone who has never been broken as I am broken. She paused in her preparations and looked directly at him. 8 years ago, raiders came to my pack territory. They killed my alpha parents, destroyed our home, took me from everything I had ever known. I was 16 years old, and I thought my life was over. For months, I prayed to the moon goddess to let me die rather than live as an Omega slave. Kade's expression softened slightly, perhaps recognizing something familiar in her quiet pain. What changed? He asked, his voice losing some of its harsh edge. I realized that my grandmother's knowledge lived in me, Elena replied, resuming her work. That I could honor her memory by using what she had taught me to help others. That even in chains I could choose to be more than just a victim of circumstances. She mixed a preparation of willow bark tea, its bitter smell filling the small cabin. I cannot give you back your legs, Alpha Kade, but I can offer you something perhaps more valuable. The chance to discover who you are when stripped of everything you thought defined you. And if what remains is nothing worth preserving, she said, offering him the cup, then at least you will know it honestly. But I suspect there is more to Kade Ironheart than the strength of his claws. She continued speaking as he stared at her in surprise. The alpha who united 3 warring packs through diplomacy before ever drawing his claws. That wolf had wisdom. The warrior who gave half his share of territory spoils to widows and orphans. That wolf had compassion. The leader who never asked his followers to face dangers he would not face himself. That wolf had honor. Kade stared at her for a long moment, as if seeing her clearly for the first time. How do you know these things? Such details are not spoken of in the general telling of my deeds. Omegas hear many things that alphas do not expect, Elena said with a small smile. We clean the halls where warriors drink and boast. We tend the wounds of wolves who speak honestly in their pain. We know which leaders are truly respected by their followers and which are merely feared. He accepted the cup from her hands, their fingers brushing briefly. His hands, she noted, were warm and steady despite his condition. There was strength there still, even if it could no longer shift into claws for battle. Why do you risk this? He asked quietly. Helping me brings you no benefit and considerable danger if you are discovered. Why does an Omega care what becomes of a fallen Alpha? Elena considered her answer carefully. How could she explain that seeing greatness brought low made her heart ache, not with satisfaction at the mighty being humbled, but with genuine sorrow for suffering? How could she tell him that his pain called to something deep within her, the part that had always felt compelled to heal what was broken, to nurture what was wounded? Because abandoning you would make me less than I choose to be, she said finally. And because I believe that how we treat those who can no longer help themselves says more about our own character than any amount of strength or glory ever could. For the first time since his return, Kade's lips curved in something that might have been the beginning of a smile. Dangerous words, Omega. Such thinking could change the world. Perhaps it should be changed, Elena replied, beginning to clean the pressure sores that had formed during his days of lying motionless. Perhaps a world that discards people the moment they become inconvenient is a world that has forgotten what truly matters. As she worked with gentle efficiency, cleaning and treating his wounds, applying salves that would ease the constant ache, Kade found himself studying this unremarkable Omega who had dared to offer kindness where others offered only abandonment. There was something in her calm competence, her quiet strength, that spoke of depths he had never bothered to notice in a lower-ranking wolf. "What is your name?" he asked as she finished her ministrations. "Elena, Alpha." "Just Kade," he said quietly. "I think I have lost the right to titles." "As you wish," she replied, packing away her supplies. "I will return tomorrow if you will have me." As she prepared to leave, Kade called after her. "Elena, what you said about finding out who I am when everything else is stripped away. What if that wolf is someone I do not wish to know?" She paused at the door, looking back at this mighty alpha reduced to questioning his very existence. "Then you change him," she said simply. "Day by day, choice by choice, until he becomes someone you can respect. That is perhaps the greatest victory of all, conquering yourself." The door closed softly behind her, leaving Kade alone with his thoughts and the lingering scent of healing herbs. For the first time in weeks, the pain in his body seemed less important than the questions stirring in his mind. Outside, the territory began to wake, but inside the small cabin, a different kind of awakening had begun. 3 days passed before anyone noticed Elena's nocturnal journeys. She had been careful, timing her visits during the deepest hours of night when most of the pack slept soundly. But Gabriel the Wise had always been a light sleeper, a trait that had served him well during his years as a negotiator, navigating treacherous dealings with rival packs. On the 4th morning, as Elena returned from Kade's cabin with her empty medicine bundle, she found Gabriel waiting by the Omega quarters, his weathered face unreadable in the gray pre-dawn light. "Interesting paths you walk in the darkness, girl," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had learned to read truth in people's actions rather than their words. Elena's heart hammered against her ribs, but she forced herself to meet his gaze steadily. Running would only confirm his suspicions, and lying to a wolf known for his ability to detect deception seemed equally futile. "I walk where I am needed," she replied, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. Gabriel nodded slowly, as if this answer told him everything he needed to know. "And what need drives an Omega to risk punishment by visiting our fallen Alpha?" The question hung between them like a blade awaiting its target. Elena understood that her next words would determine not only her own fate, but possibly Kade's as well. If Gabriel reported her actions to Alpha King Magnus, the best she could hope for was severe punishment. The worst, banishment to the winter wilderness, would mean death for both her and Kade, who had grown to depend on her care. The need to see that a wolf who served this pack faithfully for 30 years does not die alone and forgotten, she said, choosing honesty over safe lies. The need to honor the healing knowledge my grandmother taught me, even if it means risking everything. Something shifted in Gabriel's expression. Not approval exactly, but perhaps understanding. He had spent decades watching human nature reveal itself in moments of crisis, and he recognized sincerity when he encountered it. "You know the risks," he said. It was not a question. "I do. And yet you continue." "I do." Gabriel was quiet for a long moment, his breath forming small clouds in the cold air. When he spoke again, his voice carried an unexpected gentleness. "My youngest son fell through ice when he was 7 years old. By the time we pulled him from the water, his lips were blue and his body so cold I thought the life had already left him. The healers declared him beyond saving, said the cold water had taken his spirit, and we should prepare for his death." Elena listened, sensing that this story held significance beyond its surface details. But my mate refused to accept their judgment. She worked over that boy for 3 days and 3 nights, warming his body, breathing life into his lungs, forcing warm broth down his throat drop by drop. The healers said she was wasting her time, that she was prolonging his suffering for no purpose. "What happened?" Elena asked softly. "He lived, grew up strong and whole, became a fine warrior in his own right. He died gloriously in battle 5 years ago, defending our territory from rogue wolves." Gabriel's voice carried both pride and old grief. "But those extra 20 years of life, those were a gift my mate gave him through her stubborn refusal to abandon hope." The implications of his story settled between them like morning mist. Elena understood that Gabriel was telling her something important about the nature of healing, about the value of refusing to accept defeat, about the courage required to fight for life when others have given up. "I have not seen what passes between you and Kade," Gabriel continued, but I have noticed that the sounds of pain no longer drift from his cabin in the deep hours of night. I have observed that he no longer refuses the food brought to him. Small changes perhaps, but significant ones. He is strong, Elena said simply. Stronger than he knows. Strength comes in many forms, Gabriel agreed. The question is whether our Alpha King will recognize this particular form when the time comes to make hard decisions about winter supplies. The warning was clear. Alpha King Magnus would soon be forced to calculate how much food the pack could spare during the lean months ahead. Every mouth that consumed supplies without contributing to the pack's survival would face scrutiny. A paralyzed Alpha, no matter how legendary his past, would be an obvious candidate for difficult choices. How long do we have? Elena asked. The harvest is nearly complete. When the last grain is stored and the winter count is made, Magnus will have to decide who stays and who cannot be supported through the cold months. Perhaps 2 weeks, maybe 3. 2 weeks to accomplish what? Make Kade valuable enough to the pack that they would choose to keep him alive? The challenge seemed impossible. What could a paralyzed wolf contribute that would justify the food he consumed, the space he occupied, the care he required? There is something else you should know, Gabriel said, glancing around to ensure they remained unobserved. Derek the Crimson has been asking questions about the fallen Alpha. He believes that keeping Kade alive shows weakness, that it sends the wrong message to potential enemies who might see us as a pack that has grown soft. This news struck Elena like a physical blow. Derek was Magnus' chief lieutenant, a wolf whose counsel carried enormous weight in pack decisions. If he was actively arguing against supporting Kade, the situation was even more dire than she had imagined. "What would you have me do?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Continue your work," Gabriel replied. "But be prepared for the possibility that kindness alone may not be enough to save him. If Kade is to survive the winter, he must find a way to prove his value to the pack that goes beyond past glories." As Gabriel walked away, leaving Elena alone with her thoughts and fears, she realized that their time together had become a race against the approaching winter. Both the literal cold that would force hard choices about survival, and the metaphorical winter of despair that threatened to consume Kade's will to live. That evening, as she prepared her usual collection of healing supplies, Elena found herself considering new approaches to their situation. The herbs and salves she carried could ease Kade's physical pain, but they could not address the deeper wound to his sense of purpose and self-worth. If he was to survive, he needed more than medical care. He needed a reason to fight for his own life. The solution, when it came to her, was both simple and dangerous. Instead of just treating Kade's wounds, she would need to challenge him to discover new strengths, new ways to contribute to the pack's welfare. It would mean pushing him beyond the comfortable despair he had settled into, forcing him to confront the possibility that his life might still have meaning and value. But first, she would need to convince him that the effort was worthwhile. And given his current state of mind, that might prove the most difficult healing of all. As she made her way through the darkness toward his cabin, Elena carried with her not just medicines for the body, but a new determination to heal the spirit of a wolf who had forgotten his own worth. The wind carried the scent of coming snow, a reminder that winter would not wait for their healing to be complete. Time was running short, and the stakes had never been higher. The carved wooden chess pieces sat between them like tiny warriors frozen in eternal combat, their painted surfaces gleaming in the flickering candlelight. Elena had found the game board gathering dust in a corner of Kade's cabin, apparently forgotten since his injury. When she had suggested they play while his evening medicines took effect, he had looked at her as if she had proposed something scandalous. "Chess is a warrior's game," he had protested. "A test of tactical thinking, of strategic planning. What would an Omega know of such things?" "Perhaps more than you imagine," Elena had replied, already setting up the pieces with practiced efficiency. "My father was a beta before the raids. He believed that understanding strategy was as important for a daughter as needlework or herb lore." Now, 3 moves into their first game, Kade was beginning to reassess his assumptions about the quiet Omega who had become his unlikely caregiver. Her opening gambit had been both elegant and aggressive, revealing a grasp of chess theory that spoke of years of serious study. "Your father sounds like a wise wolf," Kade said, studying the board with renewed attention. "Not many betas bother teaching their daughters the arts of war. He said that in an uncertain world, everyone might someday need to think like a general," Elena replied, moving her knight to threaten his bishop. That knowledge was the one treasure that raiders could never steal if it was properly hidden in the mind. Kade's hand hovered over his pieces, considering responses to her unexpected attack. It had been months since he had engaged in serious tactical thinking, and he found his mind struggling to shake off the rust of disuse. Yet they stole everything else, he observed, not unkindly. Yes, she said simply. But they left me alive to carry his teachings forward. Perhaps that is a kind of victory. As they played, their conversation ranged across topics that had nothing to do with Kade's condition or Elena's status as an Omega. They discussed the merits of different battle formations, the challenge of governing unruly populations, the delicate balance required to maintain alliances between rival packs. Kade found himself drawn into debates about strategy and leadership that reminded him how much he had enjoyed the intellectual aspects of command. "You realize what you are doing," he said after she captured his rook with a brilliantly conceived sacrifice. "Playing chess, reminding me that my mind still functions even if my legs do not." He moved his king to safety, but they both knew she had gained a decisive advantage, making me think about something other than what I have lost. Elena considered her next move carefully, both on the board and in their conversation. "Is it working?" "Perhaps." Kade leaned back against his pillows, studying her face in the candlelight. "Tell me, what do you see when you look at me?" The question was more vulnerable than anything he had yet shared, and Elena treated it with the gravity it deserved. "I see a wolf learning to discover who he is when stripped of everything he thought defined him," she said. "Someone fighting to find new purpose in a world that no longer recognizes his old value." "And what do you think that new purpose might be?" "Only you can answer that," she replied, moving her queen to set up checkmate in 3 moves. "But I suspect it has something to do with all the knowledge locked away in your mind. 30 years of experience in leadership, tactics, diplomacy, and war. Knowledge that could benefit this pack in ways that have nothing to do with claws or fangs." Kade saw the inevitable conclusion to their game and tipped over his king in acknowledgement of defeat. "You play well for someone who learned from a dead father." "I have had 8 years to practice against myself," Elena said with a slight smile. "And recently I have been imagining games against the greatest tactical mind in Shadowmere." "Flattery will not save you from losing the next game," he warned, but his tone carried humor rather than bitterness. "We shall see," she replied, beginning to reset the pieces. As they played their second game, Kade found himself sharing memories of past campaigns. Not the glorious battles that the pack celebrated, but the complex decisions that had made victory possible. How he had convinced 3 rival packs to unite against a common enemy. How he had negotiated safe passage through hostile territory by understanding what each party truly needed. How he had resolved disputes within his own forces through careful attention to honor and pride. "These are the skills that built your reputation," Elena observed as she considered a particularly difficult position. "Not just your strength, but your wisdom." "Wisdom requires the authority to implement it," Kade replied. "What good is strategic thinking if no one will listen to your counsel?" "Authority comes in many forms," she said, moving her bishop to create a complex tactical threat. "Sometimes it comes from rank or strength, but sometimes it comes from simply being right about things that matter." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of footsteps outside the cabin. Both froze, suddenly aware of how their evening had changed from a medical visit to something approaching friendship. If someone discovered them playing chess together, talking as equals rather than alpha and omega, it could mean severe punishment for both. The footsteps passed by without stopping, but the moment had shattered their comfortable isolation. The reality of their situation, an omega caring for a disgraced alpha in defiance of pack expectations, crashed back over them like cold water. "I should go," Elena said quietly, beginning to pack away the chess pieces. "Yes," Kade agreed, though his voice carried reluctance. "But perhaps tomorrow we might finish this game if you wish." As she gathered her supplies, Kade watched her with new appreciation. The Omega he had initially dismissed as just another servant had revealed depths of intelligence and strength that commanded respect. More than that, she had given him something he had not realized he desperately needed: the experience of being valued for his mind rather than his physical prowess. "Elena," he called as she reached the door. "When I was young, my father told me that the greatest warriors were not those who never fell, but those who learned to rise stronger each time they were knocked down. I am beginning to understand what he meant. Tomorrow we shall see if you can apply that wisdom to our chess game," she replied, but her smile carried warmth that had nothing to do with their competition. After she left, Kade lay in the darkness thinking about their evening together. For the first time since his injury, he had felt like himself again. Not the broken shadow of a legendary alpha, but a wolf capable of thought, strategy, and meaningful conversation. It was a small beginning, but perhaps it was enough to build upon. Outside, the wind carried the first hints of serious winter. But inside the small cabin, something new was growing that might prove strong enough to survive the cold months ahead. The summons came at dawn, delivered by a nervous young warrior who could barely meet Elena's eyes. "Alpha King Magnus requires your presence in the Great Hall," he stammered, his hand unconsciously moving to his side as if her very existence made him uncomfortable. Elena's stomach clenched with dread, but she forced her expression to remain calm. She had known this moment would come eventually, the moment when her nocturnal visits to Kade would be brought before the pack's leadership for judgment. She had simply hoped for more time to help Kade find his footing before facing this reckoning. "I will come at once," she replied, setting down the basket of mending she had been working on. Around her, the other Omegas watched with the careful neutrality of people who had learned not to draw attention to themselves during times of trouble. The Great Hall of Shadowmere never failed to impress with its massive timber beams and soaring ceiling. Trophies and weapons from countless battles hung from the walls, creating shadows that danced in the light of the central fire pit. At the head table, Alpha King Magnus sat in his carved chair, flanked by his closest advisors. Derek the Crimson stood at his right hand, his weathered face set in grim lines. But it was the object placed on the table before Magnus that made Elena's heart skip. Her small cloth bundle of herbs and healing supplies, the one she had accidentally left behind in Kade's cabin the previous evening in her haste to return before full daylight. "Approach, Elena of the Coastal Territories," Magnus commanded, his voice echoing in the vast space. As she walked the length of the hall, her footsteps seeming unnaturally loud on the wooden floor, Elena felt the weight of dozens of eyes upon her. Warriors, craftsmen, servants. All had gathered to witness whatever judgment was about to unfold. In the werewolf world, such public proceedings served as both entertainment and education, showing everyone present the consequences of stepping beyond accepted boundaries. She stopped before the high table and bowed her head respectfully, though not in the servile manner some might have expected. Years of servitude had taught her the value of dignity, even in submission. "Do you recognize these items?" Magnus asked, gesturing to the bundle on the table. "I do, Alpha King. They were found in the cabin of our former warrior, Kade Ironheart. How do you explain their presence there?" Elena had considered many possible responses during her walk to the hall, but in the end she chose the same honesty that had served her in her conversation with Gabriel. Lies would only complicate matters, and the truth, however dangerous, at least had the virtue of simplicity. "I brought them there, Alpha King, to ease his suffering and treat his wounds." A murmur ran through the assembled crowd. Derek the Crimson stepped forward, his hand resting on his side in a gesture that was both casual and threatening. "By what authority does an Omega presume to treat one who was once our greatest warrior?" Derek demanded. "What knowledge could you possibly possess that our own healers lack?" "Knowledge taught to me by my grandmother, who learned from her grandmother before her," Elena replied. "The knowledge of plants and their properties, of how to ease pain and promote healing. As for authority, I claim none beyond that which comes from seeing suffering and being unable to ignore it." "Suffering?" Derek spat. "The wolf is already dead in everything but name. You waste medicines that could better serve those who still contribute to this pack's welfare." "With respect, Beta Derek, I believe you are mistaken." The silence that followed her contradiction was so complete that the crackling of the fire seemed loud as thunder. No Omega had ever dared to contradict Derek the Crimson in open hall. The audacity of it left even the most experienced warriors speechless. "Explain yourself," Magnus said quietly, his voice carrying a warning that one wrong word could mean her death. Elena took a steadying breath. Everything depended on the next few moments, not just her own life, but Kade's as well. If she could not convince them of his continued value, they would likely both face banishment before the day was through. "Kade Ironheart's body may be broken, but his mind remains sharp as any blade," she began. "In the evenings, as I tend his wounds, he has shared with me insights into strategy and leadership that revealed depths of wisdom earned through 30 years of command. He speaks of diplomatic solutions that prevented bloodshed, of tactical innovations that saved countless lives, of the delicate balance required to maintain unity among strong-willed wolves. Pretty words, Derek interrupted. But what use is wisdom from a wolf who cannot act upon it? What good are strategies from someone who will never again lead warriors into battle? Perhaps the greatest value, Elena said, her voice growing stronger with conviction. A wise advisor need not shift into battle form to influence the outcome of conflicts. A strategic mind can plan campaigns from any position, whether it stands in a place of honor or sits beside a humble fire. The knowledge in Kade's head represents 3 decades of hard-won experience. Are we so wealthy in wisdom that we can afford to waste such a resource? Gabriel the Wise, who had remained silent until now, leaned forward in his chair. The Omega raises an interesting point, he said thoughtfully. We have young warriors with strong backs, but little experience in leadership. Perhaps there is value in preserving the knowledge of one who has faced challenges they have yet to encounter. Knowledge can be shared without maintaining the wolf who possesses it, Derek countered. Let him speak his wisdom to those who can use it, then allow nature to take its course. And when those young warriors face situations not covered in hasty conversations, Elena asked, surprising herself with her boldness. When they need counsel in the moment of crisis, guidance that can only come from someone who has lived through similar challenges. Dead advisors offer poor counsel. Magnus had been listening to this exchange with the calculating attention of a wolf accustomed to weighing complex decisions. Now he raised his hand for silence, and the hall fell quiet once more. You speak passionately in defense of one who was once feared across territories, he said to Elena. Tell me, what do you gain from preserving his life? What benefit comes to an Omega from saving a fallen Alpha? The question struck to the heart of her motivations, forcing her to examine her own reasons for the risks she had taken. What did drive her to help Kade? Was it mere compassion or something deeper? Nothing, Alpha King, she answered finally. I gain nothing but the knowledge that I chose to act according to my conscience rather than my convenience. But perhaps the question should not be what I gain, but what we all lose if we discard valuable wolves simply because they can no longer serve in the ways they once did. Today it is Kade who faces this judgment. Tomorrow it might be any warrior who suffers serious injury, any craftsman who grows too old for his trade, any wolf who becomes inconvenient rather than useful. Her words hung in the air like a challenge to the very foundations of their society. She had not merely argued for Kade's life, but questioned the wisdom of a culture that measured worth solely by immediate utility. Magnus leaned back in his chair, his weathered face revealing nothing of his thoughts. The silence stretched until it became almost unbearable, broken only by the distant sound of wine through the trees and the soft whisper of air through the hall's high rafters. Bring him, Magnus commanded finally, his voice cutting through the tense silence like a blade through silk. If Kade Ironheart's mind remains as valuable as this Omega claims, let him demonstrate it before us all. Derek the Crimson's face darkened with displeasure. Alpha King, surely you do not intend to subject the pack to the spectacle of parading our fallen. I intend to make an informed decision, Magnus interrupted sharply. If this wolf possesses wisdom worth preserving, I would hear it from his own lips rather than through the words of others, however well-intentioned. For warriors departed to retrieve Kade, leaving Elena standing before the assembled pack like a defendant awaiting judgment. She could feel the weight of their collective gaze, some curious, others hostile, all waiting to see whether her bold claims would prove justified or merely the desperate lies of someone trying to save her own skin along with Kade's. The wait stretched endlessly, filled only with the crackling of the fire and the occasional whispered comment from the watching crowd. Elena tried to prepare herself for what was coming, but the truth was that she had no idea what state of mind Kade would be in when faced with this public examination. Their evening conversations had shown her glimpses of his returning confidence, but this would be a far more severe test than chess games played in the privacy of his cabin. When the warriors finally returned carrying Kade on a wooden litter, Elena's heart clenched at the sight of him. Even though she had helped prepare him for this moment, seeing him brought into the great hall like an invalid rather than striding in as the proud warrior he had once been was a stark reminder of how far he had fallen. But there was something in his posture, in the way he held his head high despite his circumstances, that spoke of a wolf who had not entirely surrendered to despair. His dark hair had been cut and styled in the traditional warrior fashion, and he wore his finest tunic, small gestures of pride that suggested he understood the importance of this moment. The litter bearers placed him before the high table, where all could see him clearly. For a moment, the hall fell completely silent as pack members who had not seen their former champion since his return took in the reality of his condition. Some faces showed pity, others disgust, but most revealed the uncomfortable uncertainty of wolves confronted with mortality and the fragility of strength. Kade Ironheart, Magnus began, his voice formal but not unkind. This Omega claims that your mind retains value to our pack despite your physical condition. She argues that wisdom earned through 30 years of leadership should not be discarded simply because your body can no longer shift or fight in our defense. What say you to these claims? Kade's response would determine both their fates, and Elena found herself holding her breath as he considered his words. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the authority that had once commanded armies, though it was tempered now with a humility born of suffering. I say that she speaks more kindly of my abilities than perhaps I deserve, he began, earning a few surprised chuckles from the assembled warriors. But I also say that experience once gained does not disappear simply because the body that gained it becomes broken. The battles I have fought, the decisions I have made, the mistakes I have learned from, these remain with me regardless of whether I can walk or shift. Derek stepped forward, clearly determined to expose what he saw as empty boasting. Fine words, but let us test them with reality. Young Marcus here, he gestured to a warrior of perhaps 25 years, leads a raid next week against rogue wolves along the northern border. What wisdom would you offer him that our other experienced warriors could not provide? It was a clever challenge, forcing Kade to demonstrate his value in practical terms while highlighting his inability to participate personally in the action he was advising. Elena watched nervously as Kade studied young Marcus, taking in details of his bearing, his equipment, his obvious eagerness for glory. I would tell him that eager young warriors often mistake speed for efficiency, Kade said thoughtfully. That the rogues he seeks to drive out have had all summer to prepare their defenses, and that approaching their territory directly will likely result in heavier casualties than necessary. He paused, clearly organizing his thoughts. I would suggest that he study the wind patterns carefully. Rogue defenses are always weaker during certain moon phases when their scouts are less vigilant. I would recommend timing the attack for the hour before dawn on a night when thick fog is likely, using the weather as cover for approach and withdrawal. Marcus's eyes had widened with interest, and several other young warriors leaned forward to better hear Kade's words. This was clearly knowledge they had not considered, practical wisdom that could mean the difference between successful raid and devastating defeat. Furthermore, Kade continued, warming to his subject, I would warn him that rogue territories often have hidden watchers positioned to observe approaching forces. These are typically placed at natural choke points or disguised as wandering loners. A wise raider scouts these positions days in advance and neutralizes them silently before the main attack. The hall had grown completely quiet, everyone absorbed in listening to tactical advice that could save lives and ensure success. Even Derek seemed impressed despite his obvious reluctance to acknowledge Kade's continuing value. And finally, Kade concluded, I would remind young Marcus that the true measure of a successful raid is not just what territory is gained, but how many of his warriors return safely to share in the victory. Glory that costs too many lives is no glory at all. Magnus nodded slowly, clearly weighing what he had heard. Practical wisdom indeed. But can you offer counsel beyond matters of war? Our challenges are not always solved with claw and fang. Test me, Kade replied simply. Magnus considered for a moment, then posed a question that Elena knew had been troubling him for months. The pack of Iron Ridge has approached us about an alliance between their alpha's daughter and our young warriors. They offer substantial territory and promise of mutual defense, but they also expect us to provide significant gifts and commit to supporting their disputes with neighboring packs. How do we evaluate such an offer? Kade's response demonstrated the breadth of his experience beyond simple warfare. He spoke knowledgeably about the political implications of various alliance structures, the economic calculations involved in gift negotiations, and the long-term strategic value of different types of partnerships. His analysis revealed a sophisticated understanding of diplomacy that impressed even Gabriel the Wise, who had handled such negotiations for decades. As Kade spoke, Elena watched the faces of the assembled pack members gradually shift from skepticism to genuine interest. Here was wisdom that could benefit them all, knowledge that had been earned through decades of hard experience and careful observation. Perhaps more importantly, it was knowledge that none of their younger leaders possessed, making it genuinely valuable rather than merely redundant. When Magnus finally called for silence, the hall buzzed with quiet conversations as wolves discussed what they had heard. The demonstration had clearly exceeded expectations, proving that Kade's mind remained as sharp as ever despite his physical limitations. But Derek the Crimson was not yet finished with his opposition. Impressive words, he admitted grudgingly. But wisdom without the ability to act upon it remains merely entertainment. What happens when this counsel conflicts with the desires of those who must actually implement it? What authority does a broken wolf possess to ensure his advice is followed? The question struck at the heart of the matter, challenging not just Kade's practical value, but the very nature of leadership itself. Could wisdom command respect without the backing of physical strength? In their warrior culture, authority had always flowed from demonstrated prowess in battle. How could that tradition accommodate a leader who could no longer prove himself through combat? Kade's answer would determine whether this demonstration had been enough to save his life, or whether all of Elena's efforts had merely postponed the inevitable. Dear listener, if this story has awakened something within you, if you felt the weight of Kade's fall and the courage of Elena's defiance, then don't let this journey slip away. Subscribe now, because what comes next will test everything they've built together. The real battle for survival is about to begin, and you won't want to miss a single moment of what happens when ancient traditions clash with revolutionary change. Hit that subscribe button, and let's walk together into the storm that's gathering on the horizon. Kade met Derek's challenging gaze with steady eyes, and when he spoke, his voice carried a weight that made the entire hall lean forward to listen. "You ask what authority I possess," he said quietly. "Allow me to tell you of authority I once witnessed, and perhaps you will understand that power comes in forms we do not always recognize." He paused, gathering his thoughts, and Elena noticed how the flickering firelight played across his weathered features, highlighting the lines carved by years of responsibility and decision. 20 years ago, I served under Alpha King Erickson of Northwind during the Great Siege of Raven's Hollow. For 3 months, we battered ourselves against their defenses, while our supplies dwindled and our wolves grew restless. Erickson commanded through fear and force, demanding obedience through threats of punishment. When our siege tactics failed, he ordered frontal attacks that cost us hundreds of wolves for no gain. When sickness struck our camp, he blamed the moon goddess and ordered more sacrifices. The hall was completely silent now, everyone absorbed in this tale from their legendary warriors' past. But there was another wolf in that force, a graybeard named Oliver who held no formal rank, who could barely shift due to his age, who commanded nothing but the respect earned through 60 years of hard-won wisdom. When Ericsson's strategies failed repeatedly, it was to Oliver that the younger warriors quietly turned for counsel. It was Oliver who suggested the weakness in the eastern wall, Oliver who knew the seasonal patterns of the river that supplied their water, Oliver who understood that siege warfare is won through patience and intelligence rather than brute force. Kade shifted on his litter, his gaze sweeping across the assembled faces. When the final assault came, it was Oliver's plan we followed, not Ericsson's. The Alpha King gave the orders, yes, but every wolf in that force knew whose wisdom had made victory possible. And when Oliver died the following winter, peacefully in his bed, having never again shifted into battle form, his funeral drew wolves from 5 different packs who came to honor not his strength, but his wisdom. "A pretty tale," Derek said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier conviction. "But what does it prove?" "It proves that true authority comes not from the ability to command obedience through fear, but from the respect earned by consistently offering counsel that proves valuable. A wolf who speaks wisdom will be heard regardless of whether he can enforce his words with claw and fang." Magnus leaned forward in his chair, clearly intrigued by both the story and its implications. "You speak of earning respect through wise counsel, but respect once lost can be difficult to regain. How do we know that your judgment remains sound after such a devastating fall?" It was a fair question, and one that cut to the heart of Kade's situation. How could a wolf who had failed to protect himself from falling rocks be trusted with decisions that might affect the entire pack's welfare? Kade's answer surprised everyone, including Elena. "Because," he said slowly, "my fall has taught me something I never understood during my years of victory. The true cost of failure, and therefore the real value of careful decision-making. When success comes easily, when strength seems sufficient to overcome any obstacle, it becomes easy to take risks without fully considering their consequences. But a wolf who has lost everything he valued understands the weight of each choice in ways that the perpetually victorious never can. He paused, his gaze finding Elena's face in the crowd. Moreover, this experience has shown me perspectives I never possessed when I stood at the height of my power. I have learned what it means to depend on the kindness of others, to see value in gentleness as well as strength, to understand that wisdom can come from the most unexpected sources. As if summoned by his words, a commotion erupted near the hall's entrance. The great doors burst open, admitting a blast of cold air and 3 travel-stained warriors whose urgent manner immediately commanded attention. "Alpha King," the lead warrior called out, dropping to one knee before Magnus. "We bring urgent news from the southern reaches. A rogue army of unprecedented size has been spotted moving toward our territory. Perhaps 300 wolves, well organized and disciplined. They destroy every pack in their path and show no interest in negotiation or submission. The packs of Ironwood and Deep Valley have already fallen. They will reach our lands within days." The news hit the assembly like a physical blow. 300 rogues represented a force larger than any that had threatened their region in living memory. Even combined with their allies, Shadowmere could barely field half that number of warriors. Magnus rose from his chair, his face grim with the weight of sudden crisis. "How many days do we have?" 3, perhaps 4 if the weather slows their advance," the messenger replied. "But Alpha King, there is more. They are led by someone who knows our ways intimately. Their scouts move like pack wolves. They avoid our traditional defensive positions. They strike at times and places that suggest knowledge of our customs and weaknesses." Derek the Crimson stepped forward, his earlier concerns about Kade suddenly seeming far less important in the face of immediate danger. "A traitor among us, or a rogue who has studied our methods extensively," Gabriel suggested grimly. "Either way, we face an enemy who will not be defeated by conventional tactics." The hall erupted in urgent discussion as warriors debated response options, each voice adding to the chaos of overlapping conversations. Some advocated immediate evacuation to more defensible positions. Others argued for gathering their allies and meeting the threat head-on. A few suggested attempting to negotiate with the invaders, though this option found little support among the assembled fighters. It was Kade who cut through the babble with a single sharp observation. "You are all thinking like the enemy expects you to think," he said, his voice carrying clearly despite his prone position. The authority in his tone was so complete that the entire hall fell silent. "They have studied our ways, learned our weaknesses, prepared for our traditional responses. Therefore, we must respond in ways they cannot anticipate." Magnus turned toward the litter, and Elena saw something change in the Alpha King's expression. A shift from polite attention to genuine interest in what his former champion might offer. "Speak," Magnus commanded. "First, we must determine exactly what they know and how they learned it," Kade began, his tactical mind clearly engaging with the crisis. "If there is a traitor, we need to identify them before they can provide further intelligence to our enemies. If their leader is simply well-studied in our methods, we need to understand the extent of their knowledge." He paused, organizing his thoughts with the same care he had once applied to planning major campaigns. "Second, we must abandon any strategy that relies on doing what we have always done. If they know our defensive positions, we choose new ones. If they expect us to fight in traditional formation, we adopt tactics they have never seen. If they anticipate our timing, we move when they least expect it." "And how do you propose we accomplish this miracle of innovation?" Derek asked, though his tone had shifted from skepticism to genuine inquiry. "By combining our traditional strengths with approaches borrowed from our enemies and allies," Kade replied. "The coastal packs use small mobile units to harass larger forces. The mountain wolves employ coordinated ambush tactics that can break shield walls. The rogues themselves favor defensive positions that channel attackers into killing zones. We take the best of all these methods and create something our enemy has never faced." Magnus nodded slowly, clearly impressed by the breadth of Kade's knowledge and the speed with which he had analyzed their situation. "Specific recommendations?" For the next several minutes, Kade outlined a defense strategy unlike anything Shadowmere had previously attempted. He proposed dividing their forces into multiple small units that could strike quickly and disappear, using the terrain to their advantage rather than meeting the enemy in open battle. He suggested ways to use their superior knowledge of local geography to create traps and ambushes. Most importantly, he recommended a coordinated plan that would make the rogues' greater numbers work against them by stretching their forces across multiple simultaneous threats. As he spoke, the assembled warriors found themselves nodding in agreement, recognizing the tactical brilliance of his proposals. Here was the strategic mind that had made Kade Ironheart legendary, applied now to their most desperate crisis. When he finished, the hall remained silent for a long moment. Finally, young Marcus spoke up from the crowd of warriors. "Alpha Kade," he said formally, "would you be willing to serve as strategic advisor for this campaign, to help us implement these plans and adapt them as circumstances require?" The question hung in the air like a bridge between past and future, between the wolf Kade had been and the wolf he might yet become. Elena held her breath, knowing that his answer would determine not just the outcome of the coming battle, but the direction of both their lives. More than that, it would reveal whether a warrior could find new purpose when his old identity had been stripped away, whether wisdom could prove as valuable as strength in their unforgiving world. The 3 days that followed transformed Shadowmere from a peaceful territory into a hive of purposeful activity. Kade's acceptance of his role as strategic advisor had galvanized the entire pack, giving direction to what might otherwise have been panic preparation. From his position in the Great Hall, where his litter had been placed near the planning tables, he coordinated the most complex defensive operation in the pack's history. Elena found herself at the center of this whirlwind of activity, no longer just an Omega tending a fallen Alpha, but an essential link between Kade and the fighters who would implement his strategies. Her knowledge of herbs had proven invaluable in preparing field medicines, while her quick mind and careful attention to detail made her an ideal messenger for carrying complex instructions between the strategic center and the various preparation teams. "The Eastern Ridge positions must be completed by tomorrow's dawn," Kade was saying to a group of young warriors gathered around his makeshift command post. "Remember, these are not traditional defensive positions meant to stop an advance. They are harassment points designed to slow the enemy and channel them toward our primary killing ground. Speed of withdrawal is more important than holding territory." Derek the Crimson, who had become one of Kade's most effective lieutenants once the crisis shifted his priorities, nodded grimly as he studied the carefully drawn maps spread across the table. "The withdrawal routes have been marked and cleared. Each position has 3 separate escape paths, and supply caches have been positioned at every fallback point." "Good," Kade replied. "What word from the Southern Scouts?" "The rogue advance continues steadily," Gabriel reported, consulting a collection of message strips that had arrived throughout the day. "They destroyed Oakenford yesterday and should reach our outer markers by tomorrow afternoon. The refugees who escaped confirm your assessment. Their leader moves like someone intimately familiar with pack tactics." Kade's jaw tightened with concentration. This detail continued to trouble him more than any other aspect of their situation. An enemy who understood their methods posed challenges that went beyond simple numerical disadvantage. "Have we learned anything more about this leader?" he asked. "Only rumors and fragments," Derek replied. "Some survivors speak of a tall wolf with pack markings but rogue behavior. Others mention someone who gives orders in perfect pack language before translating them for his followers. But in the chaos of attack, reliable observation becomes difficult." Elena, who had been quietly organizing medical supplies nearby, looked up from her work. "Could it be someone we know? A warrior who left the pack years ago, perhaps bearing some grudge?" The suggestion sent a chill through the gathered wolves. The possibility that they faced not just an enemy, but a personal betrayer added a layer of bitter complexity to their situation. "We have had our share of exiles over the years," Magnus said thoughtfully. "Wolves who disagreed with pack decisions or faced punishment for serious crimes. Most seek new lives in distant territories, but a few might harbor resentment deep enough to motivate such revenge. The identity of our enemy matters less than understanding his capabilities," Kade said pragmatically. "Whether traitor or scholar, he knows enough about our methods to anticipate conventional responses. Our advantage lies in doing what he cannot predict." As evening approached, the final preparations reached a fever pitch. Weapons were sharpened and distributed. Armor was checked and adjusted. Food was prepared and packed for warriors who might spend days in the field. Pups and elderly wolves were moved to the most defensible positions, where they could be protected if the primary defense lines failed. But perhaps the most crucial work was being done in Kade's corner of the Great Hall, where he continued refining the intricate plan that would determine their survival. Unlike traditional pack battle strategies, which relied on clear lines of authority and straightforward tactics, this defense required precise coordination between multiple small units operating independently across a wide area. The success of this entire operation depends on timing, he explained to his assembled subcommanders. Each unit must strike at exactly the right moment and withdraw before the enemy can respond effectively. Too early, and we reveal our positions without maximum impact. Too late, and our forces become trapped in prolonged combat they cannot win. Young Marcus, who had volunteered to lead the most dangerous harassment missions, studied the timeline Kade had developed with careful attention. How do we coordinate without howls or signals that might alert the enemy to our presence? Through careful observation and predetermined decision points, Kade replied. Each unit will know exactly what to watch for and when to act based on the enemy's movements rather than external signals. It requires trust in your packmates and confidence in the plan, but it allows for perfect surprise. Elena marveled at the transformation she witnessed in both Kade and the warriors around him. Where days before he had been a broken wolf questioning his own worth, he now commanded attention and respect through the simple expedient of consistently offering valuable counsel. The warriors who had once viewed him as a shameful burden now sought his approval and feared disappointing his expectations. More remarkably, she saw how his new role was healing something in his spirit that went beyond mere purpose. The isolation and despair that had characterized his first weeks after the injury were being replaced by a sense of connection and contribution that seemed to restore his essential humanity. "You should rest," she said quietly during a brief lull in the planning sessions. "Tomorrow will demand everything you have to give." "Rest seems impossible when so many lives hang in the balance," he replied, but his voice carried exhaustion that went beyond mere physical fatigue. "Every detail I overlook, every possibility I fail to anticipate, could mean the difference between victory and catastrophic defeat." "You cannot account for everything," she reminded him gently. "At some point you must trust in the wisdom of your planning and the courage of those who will implement it." Kade looked at her with something approaching wonder. How did an Omega become so wise in matters of leadership and strategy? "Perhaps by watching greatness closely enough to understand how it works," she replied with a small smile. "And by learning that wisdom often comes disguised as simple common sense." As the night wore on, final reports arrived from the outer scouts. The rogue force had made camp less than a day's march from Shadowmere's territory, apparently confident in their ability to overwhelm whatever resistance they might encounter. Their leader had posted guards and organized his forces with professional competence, but showed no sign of expecting the unconventional defense that awaited them. "They move like a traditional war band," the chief scout reported. "Disciplined but predictable. Their leader may understand our methods, but he appears to be following standard rogue doctrine for the actual approach." "Excellent," Kade said with satisfaction. "Overconfidence in superior numbers often leads to tactical carelessness. If they expect easy victory, they may not take proper precautions against unexpected threats." Magnus, who had spent the evening observing Kade's work with growing respect, approached the planning table as the final preparations concluded. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly. "When you returned broken from the mountains, I saw only what you could no longer do. I failed to recognize what you might yet accomplish." "No apology needed," Kade replied. "I saw the same emptiness when I looked at myself. It took someone with clearer vision to help me understand that usefulness takes many forms." His gaze found Elena's face across the hall, and she felt the warmth of gratitude, and something deeper passed between them. Their relationship had begun with simple compassion for suffering, but it had grown into something approaching genuine partnership. Two wolves who brought out strengths in each other that neither had known they possessed. "The pack owes both of you a debt that cannot easily be repaid," Magnus continued. "Your wisdom may save us all, and her courage in preserving that wisdom when others would have discarded it shows a quality of character we should all aspire to match." As the great hall finally began to empty, with warriors departing for their assigned positions and final preparations, Kade found himself alone with Elena for the first time since the crisis had begun. The maps and plans lay spread between them like the blueprints for their shared future. "Are you afraid?" she asked softly. "Terrified," he admitted honestly. Not of death. I made peace with that possibility long ago, but of failure, of leading good wolves into disaster because my judgment has been clouded by desperation or pride. Your judgment has been tested repeatedly over these past days, she reminded him. Every warrior in this pack has come to trust your counsel. Perhaps it is time you trusted it as well. And what of you? He asked. Tomorrow you will tend wounded wolves in conditions far more dangerous than anything you have faced as an Omega. Are you prepared for what may come? Elena considered the question seriously. She had indeed volunteered to serve as a field healer during the coming battle, knowing that her skills might mean the difference between life and death for wounded warriors. It would place her directly in harm's way, far from the relative safety of her former anonymity. I am prepared to do what needs doing, she said finally, just as you are prepared to lead despite your fears. Perhaps courage is not the absence of fear, but choosing to act properly in spite of it. As dawn approached, bringing with it the most crucial day in Shadowmere's history, both of them understood that everything they had built together, their friendship, their mutual respect, their shared sense of purpose, would be tested in ways that no amount of planning could fully prepare them for. The battle ahead would determine not just the survival of their pack, but whether the new identities they had discovered in each other could withstand the ultimate trial of fire and blood. The morning mist hung thick over the valley as the rogue army approached Shadowmere's outer defenses. From his elevated position overlooking the main approach, Kade watched through a gap in the rocks as 300 enemy wolves moved with the confidence of those who had never known defeat. Their leader ran at the front of the column, a tall figure whose bearing seemed oddly familiar even at this distance. Elena crouched beside Kade's litter, her healer's bag prepared for the wounded who would inevitably come. Around them, hidden among the carefully prepared positions, 40 pack warriors waited in absolute silence for the signal to begin the most crucial battle of their lives. They move exactly as predicted, Derek whispered, consulting the tactical notes Kade had prepared. Advanced scouts followed by the main force, expecting traditional defensive positions that no longer exist. Through hand signals passed silently from position to position, word spread that the enemy had reached the first trigger point. Kade felt his heart racing as months of theoretical planning suddenly became deadly reality. Everything depended on the next few moments, whether his untested strategy could work against an enemy who understood pack tactics better than any rogue should. The rogue advance scouts moved cautiously through the abandoned outer settlements, finding them empty as expected, but clearly puzzled by the complete absence of defensive preparations. No shield walls, no blocked paths, no obvious attempts to slow their progress. It was exactly what Kade had hoped. They would find nothing that would alert them to the trap being prepared. First harassment unit, prepare, Derek signaled, and 20 warriors in the eastern positions readied their weapons. The main rogue force had entered the valley proper now, spreading out into standard formation for assaulting a fortified position. Their leader gestured confidently toward the great hall visible in the distance, apparently planning a direct assault that would overwhelm any defenders through sheer numbers. It was then that Kade got his first clear look at the enemy commander, and his blood turned to ice. Ivan, he breathed, the name carrying all the weight of old betrayal and bitter recognition. Elena looked at him sharply. You know him? Ivan Bloodclaw, my former lieutenant, exiled 5 years ago for attempting to overthrow Magnus. Kade's voice carried a mix of anger and grim understanding. He knows our every defensive position, every traditional strategy, every weakness we possess. No wonder they move with such confidence. The revelation explained everything. How the rogues had known exactly which territories to target, how they had avoided the pack's traditional defensive positions, how they had timed their assault for maximum advantage. Ivan had not just joined their enemies, he had become their tactical genius. He also knows you, Elena observed quietly. Knows your methods, your preferences, your thinking patterns. Yes, Kade agreed grimly. But he knew the old Kade, the warrior who fought by traditional rules. He cannot know the strategist I have become since my fall. The irony was bitter but potentially crucial. Ivan's knowledge of Kade's previous methods might actually work against him, causing him to prepare for tactics that would never come. Derek gave the signal, and the first phase of their defense began. 20 pack warriors erupted from concealed positions along the eastern ridge, raining arrows and thrown weapons down on the rogue flanks before disappearing back into the rocks. The attack lasted perhaps 30 seconds, but its effect was devastating. Not just in terms of casualties, but in the confusion it created among wolves who had expected to face a traditional shield wall. Ivan's response was swift and professional. He wheeled his forces toward the eastern attack, sending 50 wolves to pursue the fleeing pack warriors up the treacherous mountain paths. It was exactly what Kade had hoped for. A significant portion of the rogue force drawn away from the main assault. But Ivan was too experienced to be completely fooled. Instead of committing his entire force to pursuing the harassment units, he continued advancing toward the Great Hall with his remaining 250 wolves, clearly recognizing the eastern attack as a diversion rather than the main defense. He adapts quickly, Kade observed with grudging respect for his former student's tactical skill. But he still thinks in terms of overwhelming the central position. He cannot imagine a defense with no center to overwhelm. The second phase began as the rogues approached what should have been Shadowmere's primary defensive line. Another wave of harassment attacks struck from multiple directions, north, south, and west simultaneously. Small units of pack warriors appeared just long enough to inflict casualties and create confusion before vanishing again into terrain they knew intimately. Ivan's frustration was becoming visible even at a distance. His forces were taking steady losses without ever getting the chance to engage in the decisive battle they had prepared for. Worse, the multiple small attacks were forcing him to divide his attention and his wolves, exactly as Kade had planned. Third phase, Derek signaled, and the most dangerous part of their strategy began. Instead of continuing the harassment pattern, 30 pack warriors emerged from the southern positions and formed a traditional shield wall directly blocking the path to the Great Hall. To Ivan, it must have looked like the main defensive force finally revealing itself for the climactic battle he expected. Kade watched tensely as his former lieutenant took the bait, turning his main force toward this apparent center of resistance. Everything now depended on precise timing and the courage of warriors who were about to face overwhelming odds in order to create the decisive opportunity their survival required. Ivan Bloodclaw charged toward the pack shield wall with the fury of a wolf who had finally found the traditional battle he understood. Behind him, 200 rogue wolves followed in tight formation, their confidence restored by the familiar sight of enemies standing to fight rather than melting away like smoke. "Now," Kade whispered, and Derek raised the signal that would determine their fate. The false shield wall held its position until the rogues were committed to their charge, then executed the most difficult maneuver in their entire plan. Instead of fighting, they broke formation and scattered in all directions, leaving Ivan's force rushing toward empty ground with no enemy to engage. But this was not retreat. It was the opening of a trap more deadly than any traditional defense could have provided. As the rogues charged through the gap where the shield wall had been, they found themselves in a carefully prepared killing zone. Hidden warriors emerged from concealed positions on 3 sides, raining arrows and spears down on wolves packed too tightly together to maneuver effectively. The narrow valley that had channeled their advance now became a trap from which escape required fighting through the very warriors they thought they were pursuing. Ivan's tactical genius showed itself in his immediate recognition of their predicament. Instead of panicking or attempting to continue the failed charge, he rallied his wolves into a defensive circle and began fighting his way back toward more open ground where his superior numbers could be brought to bear. "He learns quickly," Kade observed grimly as he watched his former student adapt to circumstances no rogue leader should have been able to handle. "But he still thinks like a warrior rather than a strategist." The crucial moment arrived as Ivan's force struggled to escape the killing zone. Derek and his reserves waited in the positions that would block the rogue withdrawal, but engaging them directly would mean accepting casualties their small force could not afford. Instead, Kade had planned something more subtle and more dangerous. "Elena," he said quietly, "it is time." She nodded, understanding her role in the final phase of their desperate plan. Moving carefully through the concealed paths they had prepared, she made her way toward a position where she could observe the rogue leader directly. Ivan Bloodclaw was magnificent in battle, his combat skills displaying the prowess that had once made him Kade's most trusted lieutenant. He cut through pack attackers with practiced efficiency while maintaining control of his increasingly desperate wolves. But he was also looking for something, scanning the battlefield for any sign of the tactical mind behind this unprecedented defense. "Ivan," Kade's voice echoed across the valley, amplified by the rock formations that had been chosen specifically for their acoustic properties. You face the student of war you once were, but you fight against the teacher you helped create. The rogue leader's head snapped toward the source of the voice, his eyes widening with shock as he recognized the wolf he had believed safely removed from any position of influence. Kade, Ivan's response carried across the battlefield with equal clarity. Impossible. You are broken, finished, no longer a threat to anyone. I am reborn, Kade called back, his voice carrying all the authority that had once commanded armies. Reborn through wisdom earned in suffering, through understanding gained in defeat. You know my old methods, but can you recognize what I have become? The psychological impact of this exchange was immediate and devastating. Rogue wolves who had been fighting with confidence suddenly found themselves wondering what other impossibilities their enemies might have prepared. If the legendary Kade Ironheart was somehow directing this defense, what other surprises awaited them? More importantly, Ivan's attention was now completely focused on the voice from his past, rather than the immediate tactical situation around him. It was exactly the distraction Kade had hoped for. Derek struck with perfect timing, leading his reserves in a coordinated assault that cut through the rogue formation at its weakest point. Instead of attempting to destroy the enemy force completely, which their limited numbers made impossible, the attack was designed to split Ivan's wolves into two groups, each too small to be effective individually. The plan worked with devastating precision. Half the rogues found themselves cut off from their leader, surrounded by pack warriors who knew every escape route and defensive position. The other half, including Ivan himself, were forced to retreat toward terrain that favored the defenders at every turn. But Ivan was not finished. Drawing on the tactical knowledge Kade had taught him years before, he began organizing a fighting withdrawal that threatened to salvage victory from apparent defeat. His remaining wolves moved with the discipline of veterans, covering each other's retreat while inflicting casualties on their pursuers. He remembers his lessons too well, Elena observed, watching the skilled maneuver from her concealed position. Then it is time for a lesson he never learned, Kade replied grimly. The final gambit of their desperate strategy required something no traditional pack warrior would ever consider: a direct confrontation between the broken teacher and his triumphant student, with everything depending on weapons that had nothing to do with claw or fang. Signal the final phase, Kade commanded, and Derek raised the banner that would commit them all to a resolution that would either save Shadowmere or destroy it completely. The final confrontation took place not on a traditional battlefield, but in the ancient stone circle that had served as Shadowmere's meeting place for generations. Ivan Bloodclaw stood alone, his remaining warriors either fled or fallen, while Kade faced him from his litter, surrounded by the pack that had once considered him worthless. So it ends between us, teacher, Ivan said, his claws still bloody from the day's fighting. Though I confess, I never imagined facing you like this, a broken wolf commanding from a bed while others fight his battles. This is how leadership truly works, Kade replied calmly. Not through personal prowess in combat, but through the wisdom to inspire others to greatness, something you never understood, even when I tried to teach it. Ivan's laugh was bitter. Wisdom? You call it wisdom to hide behind others while real warriors face death? I remember when Kade Ironheart led from the front, when wolves followed him because they knew he would share their dangers. I remember a different time, Kade said thoughtfully. I remember a young warrior so eager for glory that he forgot the purpose of leadership was to protect those who served under him. So hungry for recognition that he would sacrifice his packmates for personal advancement. So proud that he could not accept guidance or correction. The words struck Ivan like physical blows, each one highlighting a character flaw that had ultimately led to his exile and betrayal of his own people. You exiled me, Ivan snarled. Cast me out for daring to question your decisions, for suggesting that perhaps the great Kade Ironheart was not infallible. I exiled you for attempting to assassinate Magnus and seize control of the pack through treachery and murder, Kade corrected gently. For choosing personal ambition over the welfare of those you were sworn to protect. Magnus stepped forward, his weathered face grave with the weight of old decisions. Even then, exile seemed too harsh to some of us. But you have proven today that mercy was wasted on a heart that chose hatred over healing. Ivan's eyes swept across the assembled pack members, seeing in their faces not the fear and submission he had expected, but something closer to pity. These were wolves who had found strength in unity, who had discovered that wisdom could triumph over brute force, who had learned to value compassion alongside courage. You think you have won something here, he said desperately. But look at your champion, a cripple who cannot even stand to face his enemies. What kind of victory is this? It was Elena who answered, stepping forward with the quiet confidence of someone who had discovered her own strength through serving others. The kind of victory that proves strength comes in many forms, she said simply. You came here with 300 wolves, expecting to crush us through superior numbers and inside knowledge. Instead, you found yourself outthought and outmaneuvered by a wolf you considered finished. Perhaps that should teach you something about the nature of true power. Ivan stared at her, this Omega who dared to speak to him as an equal. And in that moment something seemed to break inside him. The fury that had sustained him through years of exile and revenge began to crumble, leaving behind only the hollow exhaustion of a wolf who had built his identity on hatred. What would you have me do? He asked finally, his voice stripped of its earlier arrogance. Beg forgiveness from those I tried to destroy? Seek mercy from the wolf whose life I came here to end? I would have you choose, Kade said quietly. The same choice I was forced to make when I lay broken and abandoned. You can cling to the wolf you were, nursing old grievances until they poison everything you touch, or you can decide to become someone better, someone worthy of the gifts you were given. The silence stretched between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. Around them, the members of Shadowmere watched with the careful attention of wolves witnessing a moment that would define not just the end of this conflict, but the principles by which they chose to live. Slowly, deliberately, Ivan Bloodclaw let his claws retract. The sound seemed to echo through the stone circle like a bell marking the end of an age. I yield, he said simply. Not to your warriors, but to the wisdom I was too proud to learn when it was freely offered. Magnus nodded gravely. Then you will face judgment for your crimes, but also the possibility of redemption if you prove worthy of it. As the immediate crisis passed and the pack began the work of treating the wounded and securing their victory, Kade found himself alone with Elena in the quiet of the Great Hall. The strategic maps that had governed their desperate defense were being carefully stored away, but between them lay the chessboard where their friendship had first begun to grow. What happens now? She asked, settling beside his litter with the comfortable familiarity of someone who had found her place in the world. Now we rebuild, Kade replied, though his eyes were bright with possibilities he had never imagined during his darkest days. We take what we have learned about the value of wisdom over strength, of cooperation over domination, and we use it to create something better than what came before. He paused, reaching out to take her hand with the same gentle care she had shown him during his healing. Magnus has offered to grant you full pack status as reward for your service. No longer an Omega, but a wolf valued for the gifts you bring to our community. Elena's smile carried all the warmth of someone who had discovered that sometimes the greatest victories came not from conquering others, but from healing what had been broken. I think, she said softly, that I have already found my true status, not through an alpha's decree, but through choosing to care for others regardless of the cost to myself. That is a freedom no one can grant or take away. Outside, the wind still howled across the valley. But inside the great hall of Shadowmere, two wolves who had learned to find strength and gentleness began planning a future that proved wisdom could indeed triumph over force, and that the strongest warriors were sometimes those who chose to lay down their weapons and pick up the tools of healing instead. The age of Claw and Fang had not ended, but alongside it, a new age of understanding had begun. 3 moons later, the great hall of Shadowmere had never seemed so warm despite the winter cold that gripped the land outside. Firelight danced across the assembled faces of pack members gathered to witness something unprecedented in their history: the formal recognition of a new position within their hierarchy. Kade sat at the high table now, not in his old warrior's chair, but in a new seat carved specifically for his role. Beside him, Magnus presided over the ceremony with the dignified bearing of an alpha who had learned that true strength meant adapting to change. For generations, Magnus began, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall, we have measured worth by the strength of Claw and the fury of Fang. We have honored those who fought bravely and mourned those who fell in battle. These traditions have sustained us through countless challenges. He paused, letting his gaze sweep across the gathered wolves. But today we recognize a truth that we nearly lost: that wisdom is as valuable as strength, that healing is as honorable as fighting, and that the greatest courage sometimes comes not from facing enemies, but from refusing to abandon those in need. Elena stood before the high table, her simple omega dress replaced by the fine clothing befitting her new status. Around her neck hung a silver medallion, the mark of Shadowmere's first official healer and counselor, a position created specifically to honor the unique gifts she had brought to their community. Elena of the coastal territories, Magnus continued, you have shown us that true power lies not in dominance but in compassion, not in conquest but in care. You risked everything to heal one we had abandoned, and in doing so, you healed us all. Rise now not as Omega, but as healer of Shadowmere, equal in honor to our greatest warriors. The hall erupted in howls of approval, a sound that would have been unthinkable mere months ago for someone of Omega status. But Elena had earned something far more valuable than rank. She had earned genuine respect. As the ceremony concluded and the celebration began, Elena found her way to Kade's side. The connection between them had deepened over the months of recovery and rebuilding, growing into something neither had quite named but both clearly felt. Quite a journey, Kade said softly, his hand finding hers. From broken Alpha and forgotten Omega to this. To exactly where we were meant to be, Elena replied, squeezing his hand gently. Though I confess, I never imagined that healing one fallen wolf would lead to healing an entire pack's understanding of itself. Gabriel approached with cups of ceremonial mead, his weathered face creased in a genuine smile. To the teacher and the healer, he toasted. May your partnership continue to guide us toward wisdom we have yet to discover. As the celebration continued around them, Derek, once Kade's harshest critic, came to offer his own acknowledgement. I was wrong about you, brother, he said simply. Both of you. I measured worth by old standards and nearly cost us everything valuable. I hope you can forgive an old warrior's stubborn pride. There is nothing to forgive, Kade replied. You did what you thought was right with the understanding you had. We have all learned that growth requires the courage to change our minds. Young Marcus, who had distinguished himself in the battle by perfectly executing Kade's tactical plans, approached with a request. Alpha Kade, several of us younger warriors were hoping you might be willing to formally teach strategy and leadership. Not just battle tactics, but the deeper wisdom of how to lead wolves who depend on us. Kade's eyes brightened at the prospect. I would be honored, but I insist that healer Elena be part of these teachings as well. Leadership without compassion is tyranny, and strategy without consideration for those it affects is merely violence with planning. As the evening wore on and the pack celebrated their survival and transformation, Ivan Bloodclaw, now stripped of his rogue status and serving a period of redemptive service to the pack, approached hesitantly. The months since his defeat had changed him, humbling the pride that had once driven him to betrayal. Teacher, he said quietly to Kade, I have been thinking about what you said that day in the stone circle, about choosing who to become rather than clinging to who we were. And what have you chosen? Kade asked without judgment. To learn what I refused to learn before, Ivan replied. That strength without wisdom is merely brutality. That leadership means serving those who follow you, not using them for personal glory. I have a long path ahead to prove myself worthy of trust again, but I am grateful for the chance to walk it. Kade nodded, understanding in his eyes. We are all walking that path, brother. Some of us just started it sooner than others. The fact that you have begun is what matters. As midnight approached and the celebration began to wind down, Magnus called for silence one final time. Before we retire, he said, I want to share a decision the council has made. From this day forward, Shadowmere will no longer exile or abandon wolves who suffer injuries that prevent them from fighting. Instead, we will seek to discover what gifts they might yet offer our community. We will measure worth not merely by battle prowess, but by wisdom, by skill, by the contribution each wolf can make according to their abilities. He paused, letting the significance of this policy change settle over the assembly. This does not make us weak. If anything, it makes us stronger, for we will waste no potential, discard no knowledge, and abandon no wolf who still has value to offer. Let it be known across all territories that Shadowmere honors all forms of strength. The howls of approval that followed spoke to a fundamental shift in their pack's identity. They were still warriors, still fierce when threatened, but they had learned to value more than just the strength of claw and fang. Later, as Elena and Kade made their way through the quieting hall toward their respective quarters, she paused at the doorway. Do you ever regret it? She asked. Not the injury itself, but where it led. Would you choose to be who you were again if you could? Kade considered the question carefully, looking back at the wolf he had been. proud, powerful, but limited in his understanding of what truly mattered. The wolf I was could break enemies and win battles, he said finally. But he could not build what we are building now. He could not teach what I am learning to teach. He could not love. He paused, the word hanging between them with all its unspoken implications. He could not value what I have learned to value. So no, I would not go back. The cost was terrible, but the gift was greater than I could have imagined. Elena's eyes shimmered with emotion. I loved my grandmother deeply, and I grieved when the raiders took her from me. But her loss led me here, to this moment, to this purpose. Perhaps that is what wisdom teaches us, that even our worst losses can lead to our greatest discoveries if we have the courage to keep moving forward. Tomorrow, Kade said softly, Magnus is announcing the formal establishment of our Academy of Strategy and Healing. He wants us to lead it together, combining tactical wisdom with healing knowledge to create something new. What do you say, Healer Elena? Shall we teach the next generation of Shadowmere wolves a new way of understanding strength? I say yes, she replied, her smile bright as moonlight. Yes to the Academy, yes to this partnership, yes to wherever this path leads us. We have already proven that together we can transform brokenness into strength. Imagine what else we might accomplish. As they parted for the night, both carrying the warmth of shared purpose and deeper feelings not yet fully expressed, the winter wind howled outside. But within Shadowmere's walls, a new warmth had taken root, one that promised to carry them through not just this winter, but all the winters to come. The fallen Alpha and the healing Omega had become something neither had imagined possible. Partners in creating a future where wisdom and compassion stood equal to strength and courage, where no wolf was considered worthless, and where even the most broken could find new purpose. Their story had become legend, but the best part of their tale was still being written. Day by day, choice by choice, healing by healing, lesson by lesson. And as word of Shadowmere's transformation spread across the territories, other packs began to wonder if perhaps there was a better way to measure worth, a deeper understanding of what it meant to be strong. The age of pure dominance was ending. The age of wisdom was beginning. And at its heart stood two wolves who had learned the greatest lesson of all. That sometimes the strongest thing we can do is choose gentleness, and that true power lies not in standing alone, but in lifting others up. The moon rose full and bright over Shadowmere that night, its silver light seeming to bless the transformation that had taken root in their midst. And somewhere in the howling wind, the spirits of ancestors whispered their approval, not for the battles won or enemies defeated, but for the wisdom gained and the compassion shown. For in the end, that was the victory that truly mattered. Beautiful soul, if you're feeling the pull of this journey, if Kade and Elena's transformation has stirred something deep within your own heart, then subscribe now, because what's coming next will show you the true power of the revolution they've started. Other packs are gathering, some to learn from Shadowmere's example, others to challenge what they see as weakness. Ancient traditions will clash with new understanding, and the academy that Kade and Elena build will face its first real test when a crisis emerges that requires both strength and wisdom to overcome. The real journey of changing their world has only just begun, and you won't want to miss a single moment of what happens when old ways meet new possibilities. Hit that subscribe button, and let's continue this extraordinary tale together, because the next chapter promises revelations, challenges, and discoveries that will take your breath away. The end.